Edo period. The Edo period, also known as the Tokugawa period, lasted from 1603 to 1868. This era was marked by nearly 260 years of peace and stability under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, which was established by Tokugawa Ieyasu after his victory at the Battle of Sekigahara. During the Edo period, Japan implemented a strict social order based on Confucian principles, dividing society into four main classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants, with the samurai class at the top. This period was characterized by the policy of sakoku, or national isolation, which severely limited foreign influence and trade. Only the Dutch and Chinese were allowed restricted trade through the port of Nagasaki. Economically, the period saw significant growth and urbanization. The development of a vibrant merchant class and the rise of a consumer culture led to the flourishing of arts and culture, including kabuki theater, ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and the tea ceremony. Intellectually, the Edo period was a time of learning and education, spreading literacy and scholarly pursuits among the samurai and common people alike. Native learning, or kokugaku, emerged to promote Japanese thought and Shinto religion, often in reaction against Confucian and Buddhist influences. The period came to an end when the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown in the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which restored imperial rule and set Japan on a path of rapid modernization and industrialization. Prologue. Ieyasu's victory over the Western daimyo at the Battle of Sekigahara, October 21, 1600, or in the Japanese calendar on the 15th day of the 9th month of the 5th year of the Keicho era, gave him control of all Japan. He rapidly abolished numerous enemy daimyo houses, reduced others, such as that of the Toyotomi, and redistributed the spoils of war to his family and allies. Red Seal Trade. The Red Seal system appears from at least 1592, under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, date of the first known mention of the system in a document. The first actually preserved Shuinjo, Red Seal permit, is dated to 1604, under Tokugawa Ieyasu, first ruler of Tokugawa, Japan. Tokugawa issued red-sealed permits to his favorite feudal lords and principal merchants who were interested in foreign trade. By doing so, he was able to control Japanese traders and reduce Japanese piracy in the South Sea. His seal also guaranteed the protection of the ships, since he vowed to pursue any pirate or nation who would violate it. Besides Japanese traders, 12 European and 11 Chinese residents, including William Adams and Jan Houston, are known to have received permits. At one point after 1621, Jan Houston is recorded to have possessed 10 Red Seal ships for commerce. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English ships, and Asian rulers basically protected Japanese Red Seal ships, since they had diplomatic relations with the Japanese shogun. Only Ming China had nothing to do with this practice, because the empire officially prohibited Japanese ships from entering Chinese ports. But Ming officials were not able to stop Chinese smugglers from setting sail to Japan. In 1635, the Tokugawa shogunate officially prohibited their citizens from overseas travel, similar to the much later Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, thus ending the period of Red Seal trade. This action caused the Dutch East India Company to become the sole officially sanctioned party for European trades, with Batavia as its Asian headquarters. Early Edo period. Tokugawa Ieyasu becomes shogun. The Edo period starts after Tokugawa Ieyasu received from Emperor Go-Yozei the title of shogun. The town of Edo became the de facto capital of Japan and center of political power. This was after Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Bakufu headquarters in Edo. Kyoto remained the formal capital of the country. Ieyasu abdicates in favor of his third son. To avoid his predecessor's fate, Ieyasu established a dynastic pattern soon after becoming shogun by abdicating in favor of Hidetada in 1605. Ieyasu gets the title of Ogosho, retired shogun, and retained significant power until his death in 1616. Ieyasu retired to Sunpu Castle in Sunpu, but he also supervised the building of Edo Castle, a massive construction project which lasted for the rest of Ieyasu's life. The result was the largest castle in all of Japan, the costs for building the castle being borne by all the other daimyo, while Ieyasu reaped all the benefits. After Ieyasu's death in 1616, Hidetada took control of the Bakufu. He strengthened the Tokugawa hold on power by improving relations with the imperial court. To this end, he married his daughter Kazuko to Emperor Go-Mizunoo. The product of that marriage, a girl, eventually succeeded to the throne of Japan to become Empress Meisho. The city of Edo was also heavily developed under his reign. Invasion of Ryukyu. The invasion of Ryukyu by forces of the Japanese feudal domain of Satsuma took place from March to May of 1609 and marked the beginning of the Ryukyu kingdom's status as a vassal state under the Satsuma domain. The invasion force was met with stiff resistance from the Ryukyuan military on all but one island during the campaign. Ryukyu would remain a vassal state under Satsuma, alongside its already long-established tributary relationship with China until it was formally annexed by Japan in 1879 as the Okinawa Prefecture. Nossa Senhora da Graça Incident. The Nossa Senhora da Graça incident was a 4-day naval battle between a Portuguese carrack and Japanese samurai junks belonging to the Arima clan near the waters of Nagasaki in 1610. The richly laden Great Ship of Commerce, famed as the Black Ship by the Japanese, sank after its captain, André Pessoa, set the gunpowder storage on fire as the vessel was overrun by samurai. This desperate and fatal resistance impressed the Japanese at the time, and memories of the event persisted even into the 19th century. Hasekura Tsunanaga, Hasekura Rokuemon Tsunanaga, was a Kirishitan Japanese samurai and retainer of Date Masamune, the daimyo of Sendai. He was of Japanese imperial descent, with ancestral ties to Emperor Kanmu. In the years 1613 through 1620, Hasekura headed the Keicho Embassy, a diplomatic mission to Pope Paul V. He visited New Spain and various other ports of call in Europe on the way. On the return trip, Hasekura and his companions retraced their route across New Spain in 1619, sailing from Acapulco for Manila and then sailing north to Japan in 1620. He is considered the first Japanese ambassador in the Americas and in Spain, despite other less well-known and less well-documented missions preceding his mission. Although Hasekura's embassy was cordially received in Spain and Rome, it happened at a time when Japan was moving toward the suppression of Christianity. European monarchs refused the trade agreements Hasekura had been seeking. He returned to Japan in 1620 and died of illness a year later, his embassy seemingly ending with few results in an increasingly isolationist Japan. Japan's next embassy to Europe would not occur until more than 200 years later, following 2 centuries of isolation, with the first Japanese embassy to Europe in 1862. Siege of Osaka. In 1614, the Toyotomi clan rebuilt Osaka Castle. Tensions began to grow between the Tokugawa and the Toyotomi clans, and only increased when Toyotomi began to gather a force of ronin and enemies of the shogunate in Osaka. Ieyasu, despite having passed the title of shogun to his son in 1605, nevertheless maintained significant influence. The Tokugawa forces, with a huge army led by Ieyasu and Shogun Hidetada, laid siege to Osaka Castle in what is now known as the Winter Siege of Osaka. Eventually, the Tokugawa were able to force negotiations, and an armistice after directed cannon fire threatened Hideyori's mother, Yododono. However, once the treaty was agreed, the Tokugawa filled the castle's outer moats with sand so his troops could walk across. Through this ploy, the Tokugawa gained a huge tract of land through negotiation and deception that they could not through siege and combat. Ieyasu returned to Sunpu Castle, but after Toyotomi Hideyori refused another order to leave Osaka, Ieyasu and his allied army of 155,000 soldiers attacked Osaka Castle again in the summer siege of Osaka. Finally, in late 1615, Osaka Castle fell, and nearly all the defenders were killed, including Hideyori, his mother, Toyotomi Hideyoshi's widow Yododono, and his infant son. His wife, Senhaima, a granddaughter of Ieyasu, pleaded to save Hideyori and Yododono's lives. Ieyasu refused and either required them to commit ritual suicide or killed both of them. Eventually, Senhime was sent back to Tokugawa alive. With the Toyotomi line finally extinguished, no threats remained to the Tokugawa clan's domination of Japan. Tokugawa Iemitsu. Tokugawa Iemitsu was the third shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty. He was the eldest son of Tokugawa Hidetada with Oeyo and the grandson of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Lady Kasuga was his wet nurse, who acted as his political advisor and was at the forefront of shogunate negotiations with the imperial court. Iemitsu ruled from 1623 to 1651. During this period, he crucified Christians, expelled all Europeans from Japan, and closed the borders of the country, a foreign politics policy that continued for over 200 years after its institution. It is debatable whether Iemitsu can be considered a kinslayer for making his younger brother Tadanaga commit suicide by seppuku. Sankin Kotai Toyotomi. Hideyoshi had earlier established a similar practice of requiring his feudal lords to keep their wives and heirs at Osaka Castle or the nearby vicinity as hostages to ensure their loyalty. Following the Battle of Sekigahara and the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, this practice was continued at the new capital of Edo as a matter of custom. It was made compulsory for the Tozama daimyos in 1635, and for the Fudai daimyos from 1642. Aside from an 8-year period under the rule of Tokugawa Yoshimune, the law remained in force until 1862. The Sankin Kotai system forced daimyos to reside in Edo in alternating sequence, spending a certain amount of time in Edo and a certain amount of time in their home provinces. It is often said that one of the key goals of this policy was to prevent the daimyos from amassing too much wealth or power by separating them from their home provinces, and by forcing them to regularly devote a sizable sum to funding the immense travel expenses associated with the journey, along with a large entourage, to and from Edo. The system also involved the daimyo's wives and heirs remaining in Edo, disconnected from their lord and from their home province, serving essentially as hostages who might be harmed or killed if the daimyos were to plot rebellion against the shogunate. With hundreds of daimyos entering or leaving Edo each year, processions were almost daily occurrences in the shogunal capital. The main routes to the provinces were the Kaido. Special lodgings, the honjin, were available to daimyos during their travels. The frequent travel of the daimyo encouraged road building and the construction of inns and facilities along the routes, generating economic activity. King Louis XIV of France instituted a similar practice upon the completion of his palace at Versailles, requiring the French nobility, particularly the ancient noblesse d'épée, nobility of the sword, to spend 6 months of each year at the palace, for reasons similar to those of the Japanese shoguns. The nobles were expected to assist the king in his daily duties and state and personal functions, including meals, parties, and, for the privileged, rising from and getting into bed, bathing, and going to church. Policy of Japanese national seclusion. Anti-European attitudes began under Hideyoshi, whose suspicion of the Europeans first began with their intimidating appearance. Their armed ships and sophisticated military power produced doubt and distrust, and following the conquest of the Philippines by the Spanish, Hideyoshi was convinced they were not to be trusted. The true motives of the Europeans came quickly into question. The Sakoku Edict of 1635 was a Japanese decree intended to eliminate foreign influence, enforced by strict government rules and regulations to impose these ideas. It was the third of a series issued by Tokugawa Iemitsu, shogun of Japan from 1623 to 1651. The Edict of 1635 is considered a prime example of the Japanese desire for seclusion. The Edict of 1635 was written to the two commissioners of Nagasaki, a port city located in southwestern Japan. Only Nagasaki Island is open, and only to traders from the Netherlands. The Japanese were to be kept within Japan's own boundaries. Strict rules were set to prevent them from leaving the country. Anyone caught trying to leave the country, or anyone who managed to leave and then returned from abroad, was to be executed. Europeans who entered Japan illegally would face the death penalty too. Catholicism was strictly forbidden. Those found practicing the Christian faith were subject to investigation, and anyone associated with Catholicism would be punished. To encourage the search for those who still followed Christianity, rewards were given to those who were willing to turn them in. Prevention of missionary activity was also stressed by the edict. No missionary was allowed to enter, and if apprehended by the government, he would face imprisonment. Trade restrictions and strict limitations on goods were set to limit the ports open to trade, and the merchants who would be allowed to engage in trade. Relations with the Portuguese were cut off entirely. Chinese merchants and those of the Dutch East India Company were restricted to enclaves in Nagasaki. Trade was also conducted with China through the semi-independent vassal kingdom of the Ryukyus, with Korea via the Tsushima domain, and also with the Ainu people through the Matsumai domain. Shimabara Rebellion. The Shimabara Rebellion was an uprising that occurred in the Shimabara domain of the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan from 17th December 1637 to 15th April 1638. Matsukura Katsuya, the daimyo of the Shimabara domain, enforced unpopular policies set by his father, Matsukura Shigemasa, that drastically raised taxes to construct the new Shimabara castle and violently prohibited Christianity. In December 1637, an alliance of local Ronin and mostly Catholic peasants, led by Amakusa Shiro, rebelled against the Tokugawa shogunate due to discontent over Katsui's policies. The Tokugawa shogunate sent a force of over 125,000 troops, supported by the Dutch, to suppress the rebels and defeated them after a lengthy siege against their stronghold at Hara Castle in Minamishimabara. Following the successful suppression of the rebellion, Shiro and an estimated 37,000 rebels and sympathizers were executed by beheading, and the Portuguese traders suspected of helping them were expelled from Japan. Katsui was investigated for misruling and was eventually beheaded in Edo, becoming the only daimyo to be executed during the Edo period. The Shimabara domain was given to Koriki Tadafusa. Japan's policies of national seclusion and persecution of Christianity were tightened until the Bakumatsu in the 1850s. Shimabara rebellion is often portrayed as a Christian rebellion against violent suppression by Matsukura Katsue. However, the main academic understanding is that the rebellion was mainly against Matsukura's misgovernance by peasants, with Christians later joining the rebellion. The Shimabara Rebellion was the largest civil conflict in Japan during the Edo period, and was one of only a handful of instances of serious unrest during the relatively peaceful period of the Tokugawa shogunate's rule. Kanei, Great Famine. The Kanei Great Famine was a famine which affected Japan during the reign of Empress Meisho in the Edo period. The estimated number of deaths due to starvation is between 50,000 and 100,000. It happened due to a combination of government overspending, rinderpest epizootic, volcanic eruptions, and extreme weather. The Bakufu government used the practices learned during the Kanei Great Famine for the management of the later famines, most notably during the Tenpo famine in 1833. Also, together with the expulsion of Christianity from Japan, the Kanei Great Famine set a template for how the Bakufu would address countrywide problems bypassing daimyo. The governing structures of several clans were streamlined. Finally, greater protection of peasants from arbitrary taxes of local lords was implemented. Middle Edo period, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu died in early 1651 at the age of 47. After his death, the Tokugawa dynasty was at major risk. Ieyasu, the heir, was only 10 years old. Nonetheless, despite his age, Minamoto no Ieyasu became shogun in Keian 4, 1651. Until he came of age, 5 regents were to rule in his place, but Shogun Ieyasu nevertheless assumed a role as formal head of the Bakufu bureaucracy. The first thing that Shogun Ieyasu and the regency had to address was the ronin, masterless samurai. During the reign of Shogun Ieyasu, 2 samurai, Yui Shosetsu and Marubashi Chuya, had been planning an uprising in which the city of Edo would be burned to the ground and, amidst the confusion, Edo Castle would be raided, and the shogun, other members of the Tokugawa, and high officials would be executed. Similar occurrences would happen in Kyoto and Osaka. Shosetsu was himself of humble birth, and he saw Toyotomi Hideyoshi as his idol. Nonetheless, the plan was discovered after the death of Ieyasu, and Ieyasu's regents were brutal in suppressing the rebellion, which came to be known as the Keian Uprising or the Tosa Conspiracy. Chuya was brutally executed along with his family and Shosetsu's family. Shosetsu chose to commit seppuku rather than being captured. In 1652, about 800 ronin led a small disturbance on Sado Island, and this was also brutally suppressed. But for the most part, the remainder of Ieyasu's rule was not disturbed anymore by the ronin as the government became more civilian-oriented. Though Ieyasu proved to be an able leader, affairs were largely controlled by the regents his father had appointed, even after Ieyasu was declared old enough to rule in his own right. Shakushine's Revolt. Shakushine's Revolt was an Ainu rebellion against Japanese authority on Hokkaido between 1669 and 1672. It was led by Ainu chieftain Shakushine against the Matsumai clan, who represented Japanese trading and governmental interests in the area of Hokkaido, then controlled by the Japanese, Yamato people. The war began as a fight for resources between Shakushine's people and a rival Ainu clan in the Shibuchari River, Shizunai River basin of what is now Shinhidaka, Hokkaido. The war developed into a last try by the Ainu to keep their political independence and regain control over the terms of their trade relations with the Yamato people. Tokugawa Tsunayoshi. In 1682, Shogun Tsunayoshi ordered his censors and police to raise the living standard of the people. Soon, prostitution was banned, waitresses could not be employed in tea houses, and rare and expensive fabrics were banned. Most probably, smuggling began as a practice in Japan soon after Tsunayoshi's authoritarian laws came into effect. Nonetheless, due again to maternal advice, Tsunayoshi became very religious, promoting the Neo-Confucianism of Jushi. In 1682, he read to the daimyos an exposition of the Great Learning, which became an annual tradition at the shogun's court. He soon began to lecture even more, and in 1690 lectured about Neo-Confucian work to Shinto and Buddhist daimyos, and even to envoys from the court of Emperor Higashiyama in Kyoto. He also was interested in several Chinese works, namely The Great Learning, Da Shui, and the classic of filial piety, Xiaojing. Tsunayoshi also loved art and no theater. Owing to religious fundamentalism, Tsunayoshi sought protection for living beings in the later parts of his rule. In the 1690s and first decade of the 1700s, Tsunayoshi, who was born in the year of the dog, thought he should take several measures concerning dogs. A collection of edicts released daily, known as the Edicts on Compassion for Living Things, told the populace, among other things, to protect dogs, since in Edo there were many stray and diseased dogs walking around the city. In 1695, there were so many dogs that Edo began to smell horribly. Finally, the issue was taken to an extreme as over 50,000 dogs were deported to kennels in the suburbs of the city where they would be housed. They were apparently fed rice and fish at the expense of the tax-paying citizens of Edo. For the latter part of Tsunayoshi's reign, he was advised by Yanagisawa Yoshiyasu. It was a golden era of classic Japanese art known as the Genroku era. Jokyo Uprising. The Jokyo Uprising was a large-scale peasant uprising that happened in 1686, in the third year of the Jokyo era during the Edo period, in Azumidaira, Japan. Azumidaira at that time was a part of the Matsumoto domain under the control of the Tokugawa shogunate. The domain was ruled by the Mizuno clan at the time. Numerous incidents of peasant uprising have been recorded in the Edo period, and in many cases, the leaders of the uprisings were executed afterward. Those executed leaders have been admired as gimin, non-religious martyrs, with the most famous gimin being the possibly fictitious Sakura Sogoro. But the Jokyo uprising was unique in that not only the leaders of the uprising, former or incumbent village heads who did not personally suffer from the heavy taxes, but also a 16-year-old girl, subject of the book Oshion by Otsubo Kazuko, who had helped her father, the deputy ringleader, were caught and executed. On top of that, the leaders of the uprising clearly recognized what was at stake. They realized that the real issue was abuse of rights within a feudal system, because the newly raised tax level was equivalent to a 70% tax rate, an impossible rate. The Mizunos compiled Shimpu Toki, an official record of the Matsumoto domain, about 40 years after the uprising. This Shimpu Toki is the major and credible source of information concerning the uprising. Wakan Sansai Zue published. The Wakan Sansai Zue is an illustrated Japanese Leishu encyclopedia published in 1712 in the Edo period. It consists of 105 volumes in 81 books. Its compiler was Terashima, a doctor from Osaka. It describes and illustrates various activities of daily life, such as carpentry and fishing, as well as plants and animals and constellations. It depicts the people of different, strange lands, Ikoku, and outer barbarian peoples. As seen from the title of the book, Terajima's idea was based on a Chinese encyclopedia, specifically the Ming work Sankai Tuhui, Pictorial or Illustrated Compendium of the Three Powers, by Wang Qi, 1607, known in Japan as the Sansai Zue, Sankai Tuhui. Reproductions of the Wakan Sansai Zue are still in print in Japan. Tokugawa Yoshimune. Yoshimune succeeded to the post of the shogun in Shotoku I, 1716. His term as shogun lasted for 30 years. Yoshimune is considered among the best of the Tokugawa shoguns. Yoshimune is known for his financial reforms. He dismissed the conservative advisor Arai Hakuseki, and he began what would come to be known as the Kyoho Reforms. Although foreign books had been strictly forbidden since 1640, Yoshimune relaxed the rules in 1720, starting an influx of foreign books and their translations into Japan, and initiating the development of Western studies, or Rangaku. Yoshimune's relaxation of the rules may have been influenced by a series of lectures delivered before him by the astronomer and philosopher Nishikawa Jokin. Liberalization of Western knowledge. Although most Western books were forbidden from 1640, rules were relaxed under Shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune in 1720, which started an influx of Dutch books and their translations into Japanese. One example is the 1787 publication of Morishima Churio's Sayings of the Dutch, recording much knowledge received from the Dutch. The book details a vast array of topics. It includes objects such as microscopes and hot air balloons, discusses Western hospitals and the state of knowledge of illness and disease, outlines techniques for painting and printing with copper plates. It describes the makeup of static electricity generators and large ships, and it relates updated geographical knowledge. Between 1804 and 1829, Schools opened throughout the country by the shogunate, bakufu, as well as terakoya, temple schools, helped spread the new ideas further. By that time, Dutch emissaries and scientists were allowed much more free access to Japanese society. The German physician Philipp Franz von Siebold, attached to the Dutch delegation, established exchanges with Japanese students. He invited Japanese scientists to show them the marvels of Western science, learning in return much about the Japanese and their customs. In 1824, von Siebold began a medical school in the outskirts of Nagasaki. Soon, this Narutaki Juku grew into a meeting place for about 50 students from all over the country. While receiving a thorough medical education, they helped with the naturalistic studies of von Siebold, Kyoho reforms. The Kyoho reforms were an array of economic and cultural policies introduced by the Tokugawa shogunate between 1722 and 1730 during the Edo period to improve its political and social status. These reforms were instigated by the 8th Tokugawa shogun of Japan, Tokugawa Yoshimune, encompassing the first 20 years of his shogunate. The name Kyoho reforms refers to the Kyoho period, July 1716, April 1736. The reforms were aimed at making the Tokugawa shogunate financially solvent and to some degree to improve its political and social security. Because of the tensions between Confucian ideology and the economic reality of Tokugawa Japan, Confucian principles that money was defiling versus the necessity for a cash economy, Yoshimune found it necessary to shelve certain Confucian principles that were hampering his reform process. The Kyoho reforms included an emphasis on frugality, as well as the formation of merchant guilds that allowed greater control and taxation. The ban on Western books, minus those relating or referring to Christianity, was lifted to encourage the import of Western knowledge and technology. The alternate attendance, Sankin Kotai rules, were relaxed. This policy was a burden on daimyos due to the cost of maintaining two households and moving people and goods between them, while maintaining a show of status and defending their lands when they were absent. The Kyoho reforms relieved this burden somewhat in an effort to gain support for the shogunate from the daimyos. Tokugawa Ishige. Uninterested in government affairs, Ishige left all decisions in the hands of his chamberlain, Uka Tadamitsu, 1709-1760. He officially retired in 1760 and assumed the title of Ogosho, appointed his first son Tokugawa Ieyasu as the 10th shogun, and died the following year. Ieshige's reign was beset by corruption, natural disasters, periods of famine, and the emergence of the mercantile class, and his clumsiness in dealing with these issues greatly weakened the rule of Tokugawa. Great Tenmei Famine. The Great Tenmei Famine was a famine which affected Japan during the Edo period. It is considered to have begun in 1782 and lasted until 1788. It was named after the Tenmei era, 1781-1789, during the reign of Emperor Kokaku. The ruling shoguns during the famine were Tokugawa Ieyasu and Tokugawa Ienari. The famine was the deadliest one during the early modern period in Japan. Late Edo period Kansei reforms. The Kansei reforms were a series of reactionary policy changes and edicts which were intended to cure a range of perceived problems which had developed in mid-18th century Tokugawa Japan. Kansei refers to the Nengo that spanned the years from 1789 through 1801, with the reforms occurring during the Kansei period, but between the years 1787 to 1793. In the end, the shogunate's interventions were only partly successful. Intervening factors like famine, floods, and other disasters exacerbated some of the conditions which the shogun intended to ameliorate. Matsudaira Sadanobu, 1759-1829, was named the shogun's chief counselor, Roju, in the summer of 1787, and early in the next year he became the regent for the 11th shogun, Tokugawa Ienari. As the chief administrative decision-maker in the Bakufu hierarchy, He was in a position to effect radical change, and his initial actions represented an aggressive break with the recent past. Sadanobu's efforts were focused on strengthening the government by reversing many of the policies and practices which had become commonplace under the regime of the previous shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Sadanobu increased the bakufu's rice reserves and required daimyos to do the same. He reduced expenditures in cities, set aside reserves for future famines, and encouraged peasants in cities to go back to the countryside. He tried to institute policies that promoted morality and frugality, such as prohibiting extravagant activities in the countryside and curbing unlicensed prostitution in the cities. Sadanobu also canceled some debts owed by daimyos to the merchants. These reform policies could be interpreted as a reactionary response to the excesses of his Roju predecessor, Tanuma Okitsugu, 1719 to 1788. The result was that the Tanuma initiated liberalizing reforms within the bakufu, and the relaxation of sakoku, Japan's closed-door policy of strict control of foreign merchants, were reversed or blocked. Education policy was changed through the Kansei Edict of 1790, which enforced teaching of the Neo-Confucianism of Jushi as the official Confucian philosophy of Japan. The decree banned certain publications and enjoined strict observance of Neo-Confucian doctrine, especially with regard to the curriculum of the official Hayashi school. This reform movement was related to three others during the Edo period: the Kyoho reforms, 1722-30, the Tenpo reforms of 1841-43, and the Keio reforms, 1864-67. Edict to repel foreign vessels. The Edict to repel foreign vessels was a law promulgated by the Tokugawa shogunate in 1825 to the effect that all foreign vessels should be driven away from Japanese waters. An example of the law being put into practice was the Morrison Incident of 1837, in which an American merchant vessel attempting to use the return of Japanese castaways as leverage to initiate trading was fired upon. The law was repealed in 1842. Tenpo famine. The Tenpo famine, also known as the Great Tenpo famine, was a famine that affected Japan during the Edo period. Considered to have lasted from 1833 to 1837, it was named after the Tenpo era, 1830-1844, during the reign of Emperor Ninko. The ruling shogun during the famine was Tokugawa Ieyasu. The famine was most severe in northern Honshu, and was caused by flooding and cold weather. The famine was one of a series of calamities that shook the faith of the people in the ruling bakufu. During the same period as the famine, there were also the Kogo fires of Edo, 1834, and a 7.6 magnitude earthquake in the Sanriku region, 1835. In the last year of the famine, Oshio Heihachiro led a revolt in Osaka against corrupt officials who refused to help feed the impoverished residents of the city. Another revolt sprung up in Choshu Domain. Also in 1837, the American merchant vessel Morrison appeared off the coast of Shikoku and was driven away by coastal artillery. Those incidents made the Tokugawa bakufu look weak and powerless, and they exposed the corruption of the officials who profited while the commoners suffered. Arrival of the Black Ships. The Perry Expedition, Arrival of the Black Ships, was a diplomatic and military expedition during 1853-54 to the Tokugawa shogunate involving two separate voyages by warships of the United States Navy. The goals of this expedition included exploration, surveying, and the establishment of diplomatic relations and negotiation of trade agreements with various nations of the region. Opening contact with the government of Japan was considered a top priority of the expedition and was one of the key reasons for its inception. The expedition was commanded by Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry, under orders from President Millard Fillmore. Perry's primary goal was to force an end to Japan's 220-year-old policy of isolation and to open Japanese ports to American trade through the use of gunboat diplomacy if necessary. The Perry expedition led directly to the establishment of diplomatic relations between Japan and the Western great powers, and eventually to the collapse of the ruling Tokugawa shogunate and the restoration of the emperor. Following the expedition, Japan's burgeoning trade routes with the world led to the cultural trend of Japanism, in which aspects of Japanese culture influenced art in Europe and America. Decline, Bakumatsu period. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the shogunate showed signs of weakening. The dramatic growth of agriculture that had characterized the early Edo period had ended, and the government handled the devastating Tenpo famines poorly. Peasant unrest grew and government revenues fell. The shogunate cut the pay of the already financially distressed samurai, many of whom worked side jobs to make a living. Discontented samurai were soon to play a major role in engineering the downfall of the Tokugawa shogunate. The arrival in 1853 of a fleet of American ships commanded by Commodore Matthew C. Perry threw Japan into turmoil. The U.S. government aimed to end Japan's isolationist policies. The shogunate had no defense against Perry's gunboats and had to agree to his demands that American ships be permitted to acquire provisions and trade at Japanese ports. The Western powers imposed what became known as unequal treaties on Japan, which stipulated that Japan must allow citizens of these countries to visit or reside on Japanese territory and must not levy tariffs on their imports or try them in Japanese courts. The shogunate's failure to oppose the Western powers angered many Japanese, particularly those of the southern domains of Choshu and Satsuma. Many samurai there, inspired by the nationalist doctrines of the Kokugaku school, adopted the slogan of Sono Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The two domains went on to form an alliance. In August 1866, soon after becoming shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu struggled to maintain power as civil unrest continued. The Choshu and Satsuma domains in 1868 convinced the young Emperor Meiji and his advisors to issue a rescript calling for an end to the Tokugawa shogunate. The armies of Choshu and Satsuma soon marched on Edo, and the ensuing Boshin War led to the fall of the shogunate. Bakumatsu was the final years of the Edo period when the Tokugawa shogunate ended. The major ideological political divide during this period was between the pro-imperial nationalists called Isshin-shishi and the shogunate forces, which included the elite Shinsengumi swordsmen. The turning point of the Bakumatsu was during the Boshin War and the Battle of Toba Fushimi, when pro-shogunate forces were defeated. End of the Sakoku. The Convention of Kanagawa, or the Japan-U.S. Treaty of Peace and Amity, was a treaty signed between the United States and the Tokugawa shogunate on March 31, 1854. Signed under threat of force, it effectively meant the end of Japan's 220-year-old policy of national seclusion, Sakoku, by opening the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American vessels. It also ensured the safety of American castaways and established the position of an American consul in Japan. The treaty precipitated the signing of similar treaties establishing diplomatic relations with other Western powers. Internally, the treaty had far-reaching consequences. Decisions to suspend previous restrictions on military activities led to rearmament by many domains and further weakened the position of the shogun. Debate over foreign policy and popular outrage over perceived appeasement to the foreign powers was a catalyst for the Sono Joi movement and a shift in political power from Edo back to the imperial court in Kyoto. The opposition of Emperor Komei to the treaties further lent support to the Tobaku, overthrow the shogunate, movement, and eventually to the Meiji Restoration, which affected all realms of Japanese life. Following this period came an increase in foreign trade, the rise of Japanese military might, and the later rise of Japanese economic and technological advancement. Westernization at the time was a defense mechanism, but Japan has since found a balance between Western modernity and Japanese tradition. Nagasaki Naval Training Center established the Nagasaki Naval Training Center was a naval training institute between 1855, when it was established by the government of the Tokugawa shogunate, until 1859, when it was transferred to Tsukiji in Edo. During the Bakumatsu period, the Japanese government faced increasing incursions by ships from the Western world, intent on ending the country's 2 centuries of isolationist foreign policy. These efforts culminated in the landing of United States Commodore Matthew Perry in 1854, resulting in the Treaty of Kanagawa and the opening of Japan to foreign trade. The Tokugawa government decided to order modern steam warships and to build a naval training center as part of its modernization efforts to meet the perceived military threat posed by the more advanced Western navies. Officers of the Royal Netherlands Navy were in charge of education. The curriculum was weighed towards navigation and Western science. The training institute was also equipped with Japan's first steamship, Kankomaru, given by the King of the Netherlands in 1855. It was later joined by the Konran Maru and the Choyo. The decision to terminate the school was made for political reasons, arising from the Japanese side as well as from the Dutch side. While the Netherlands feared that the other Western powers would suspect that they were helping the Japanese accumulate naval power to repulse Westerners, the shogunate became reluctant to give samurai from traditionally anti-Tokugawa domains opportunities to learn modern naval technology. Although the Nagasaki Naval Training Center was short-lived, it had considerable direct and indirect influence on future Japanese society. The Nagasaki Naval Training Center educated many naval officers and engineers who would later become not only founders of the Imperial Japanese Navy, but also promoters of Japan's shipbuilding and other industries. Treaty of Tientsin. The Qing dynasty is forced to agree to unequal treaties, which opened more Chinese ports to foreign trade, permitted foreign legations in the Chinese capital Beijing, allowed Christian missionary activity, and effectively legalized the import of opium. This sends shockwaves to Japan, showing the strength of the Western powers. Japanese Embassy to the United States. The Japanese Embassy to the United States, Manin Ganin Kenbei Shisetsu, lit. First year of the Manin-era mission to America, was dispatched in 1860 by the Tokugawa shogunate, Bakufu. Its objective was to ratify the new Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between the United States and Japan, in addition to being Japan's first diplomatic mission to the United States since the 1854 opening of Japan by Commodore Matthew Perry. Another significant facet of the mission was the shogunate's dispatch of a Japanese warship, the Konran Maru, to accompany the delegation across the Pacific and thereby demonstrate the degree to which Japan had mastered Western navigation techniques and ship technologies barely 6 years after ending its isolation policy of nearly 250 years. Sakuradamon Incident. Naosuke, chief minister of the Tokugawa shogunate, was assassinated on March 24, 1860, by Ronin samurai of the Mito domain and Satsuma domain outside the Sakurada gate of Edo Castle. Naosuke was a proponent of the reopening of Japan after more than 200 years of seclusion, was widely criticized for signing the 1858 Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the United States consul Townsend Harris, and soon afterwards, similar treaties with other Western countries. From 1859, the ports of Nagasaki, Hakodate, and Yokohama became open to foreign traders as a consequence of the treaties. Order to expel barbarians. The order to expel barbarians was an edict issued by the Japanese Emperor Komei in 1863 against the westernization of Japan following the opening of the country by Commodore Perry in 1854. The edict was based on widespread anti-foreign and legitimist sentiment called the Sono Joy, Revere the Emperor, Expel the Barbarians movement. Emperor Komei personally agreed with such sentiments, and, breaking with centuries of imperial tradition, began to take an active role in matters of state. As opportunities arose, he fulminated against the treaties and attempted to interfere in the shogunal succession. The shogunate had no intention of enforcing the order, and the edict inspired attacks against the shogunate itself, as well as against foreigners in Japan. The most famous incident was the firing on foreign shipping in the Shimonoseki Strait off Choshu Province as soon as the deadline was reached. Masterless samurai, Ronin, rallied to the cause, assassinating shogunate officials and Westerners. The killing of the English trader Charles Lennox Richardson is sometimes considered as a result of this policy. The Tokugawa government was required to pay an indemnity of 100,000 British pounds for Richardson's death. But this turned out to be the zenith of the Sano-Joi movement, since the Western powers responded to Japanese attacks on Western shipping with the bombardment of Shimonoseki. Heavy reparations had earlier been demanded from Satsuma for the murder of Charles Lennox Richardson, the Namamugi incident. When these were not forthcoming, a squadron of Royal Navy vessels went to the Satsuma port of Kagoshima to coerce the daimyo into paying. Instead, he opened fire on the ships from his shore batteries, and the squadron retaliated. This was later referred to inaccurately as the bombardment of Kagoshima. These incidents clearly showed that Japan was no match for Western military might, and that brutal confrontation could not be the solution. These events, however, also served to further weaken the shogunate, which appeared too powerless and compromising in its relations with Western powers. Ultimately, the rebel provinces allied and overthrew the shogunate in the Boshin War and the subsequent Meiji Restoration. Shimonoseki Campaign. The Shimonoseki Campaign refers to a series of military engagements in 1863 and 1864. Fought to control the Shimonoseki Straits of Japan by joint naval forces from Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States, against the Japanese feudal domain of Choshu, which took place off and on the coast of Shimonoseki, Japan. Tenchugumi Incident. The Tenchugumi Incident was a military uprising of Sano-Joi, revere the emperor and expel the barbarians, activists in Yamato Province, now Nara Prefecture, on 29 September 1863, during the Bakumatsu period. Emperor Komei had issued a dispatch to Shogun Tokugawa Yamochi to expel the foreigners from Japan in early 1863. The shogun answered with a visit to Kyoto in April, but he rejected the demands of the Joi faction. On September 25th, the emperor announced he would travel to Yamato Province, to the grave of Emperor Jimmu, the mythical founder of Japan, to announce his dedication to the Joi cause. Following this, a group called Tenchugumi, consisting of 30 samurai and ronin from Tosa and other fiefs, marched into Yamato Province and took over the magistrate office in Gojo. They were led by Yoshimura Torataro. The next day, shogunate loyalists from Satsuma and Aizu reacted by expelling several imperial officials of the Sano-Joi faction from the imperial court in Kyoto in the Bunkyu coup. The shogunate sent troops to quell the Tenchugumi, and they were finally defeated in September 1864. Mito Rebellion. The Mito Rebellion was a civil war that occurred in the area of Mito Domain in Japan between May 1864 and January 1865. It involved an uprising and terrorist actions against the central power of the shogunate in favor of the Sano-Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians on policy. A shogunal pacification force was sent to Mount Tsukuba on 17 June 1864, consisting of 700 Mito soldiers led by Ichikawa, with 3 to 5 cannons and at least 200 firearms, as well as a Tokugawa shogunate force of 3,000 men with over 600 firearms and several cannons. As the conflict escalated, on 10 October 1864 at Nakaminato, the shogunate force of 6,700 was defeated by 2,000 insurgents, and several shogunal defeats followed. The insurgents were weakening, however, dwindling to about 1,000. By December 1864, they faced a new force under Tokugawa Yoshinobu, himself born in Mito, numbering over 10,000, which ultimately forced them to surrender. The uprising resulted in 1,300 dead on the rebels' side, which suffered vicious repression, including 353 executions and approximately 100 who died in captivity. Kinmon Incident. In March 1863, the Shishi rebels sought to take control of the emperor to restore the imperial household to its position of political supremacy. During what was a bloody crushing of the rebellion, the leading Choshu clan was held responsible for its instigation. To counter the rebels' kidnapping attempt, armies of the Aizu and Satsuma domains, the latter led by Saigo Takamori, led the defense of the imperial palace. However, during the attempt, the rebels set Kyoto on fire, starting with the residence of the Takatsukasa family and that of a Choshu official. The shogunate followed the incident with a retaliatory armed expedition, the First Choshu Expedition, in September 1864. First Choshu Expedition. The First Choshu Expedition was a punitive military expedition by the Tokugawa shogunate against the Choshu domain in September-November 1864. The expedition was in retaliation for Choshu's role in the attack on the Kyoto Imperial Palace during the Kinmon incident in August 1864. The expedition ended in a nominal victory for the shogunate after a deal negotiated by Saigo Takamori allowed Choshu to hand over the ringleaders of the Kinmon incident. The conflict finally led to a compromise brokered by the Satsuma domain at the end of 1864. Although Satsuma initially jumped on the opportunity to weaken its traditional Choshu enemy, it soon realized that the intention of the Bakufu was first to neutralize Choshu and then to neutralize Satsuma. For this reason, Saigo Takamori, who was one of the commanders of the shogunate forces, proposed to avoid fighting and instead obtain the leaders responsible for the rebellion. Choshu was relieved to accept, as were the shogunate forces, who were not much interested in battle. Thus ended the First Choshu expedition without a fight, as a nominal victory for the Bakufu. Second Choshu Expedition. The Second Choshu Expedition was announced on the 6th of March 1865. The operation started on 7 June 1866 with the bombardment of Suo Oshima in Yamaguchi Prefecture by the navy of the Bakufu. The expedition ended in military disaster for the shogunate troops, as Choshu forces were modernized and organized effectively. By contrast, the shogunate army was composed of antiquated feudal forces from the Bakufu and numerous neighboring domains, with only small elements of modernized units. Many domains put up only half-hearted efforts, and several outright refused shogunate orders to attack, notably Satsuma, who had by this point entered into an alliance with Choshu. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the new shogun, managed to negotiate a ceasefire after the death of the previous shogun, but the defeat fatally weakened the shogunate's prestige. Tokugawa military prowess was revealed to be a paper tiger, and it became apparent that the shogunate could no longer impose its will upon the domains. The disastrous campaign is often seen to have sealed the fate of the Tokugawa shogunate. The defeat stimulated the Bakufu in making numerous reforms to modernize its administration and army. Yoshinobu's younger brother Ashitake was sent to the 1867 Paris Exposition. Western dress replaced Japanese dress at the shogunal court, and collaboration with the French was reinforced, leading to the 1867 French military mission to Japan. Tokugawa Yoshinobu. Prince. Tokugawa Yoshinobu was the 15th and last shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan. He was part of a movement which aimed to reform the aging shogunate, but was ultimately unsuccessful. Immediately upon Yoshinobu's ascension as shogun, major changes were initiated. A massive government overhaul was undertaken to initiate reforms that would strengthen the Tokugawa government. In particular, assistance from the Second French Empire was organized, with the construction of the Yokosuka Arsenal under Léonce Verny and the dispatch of a French military mission to modernize the armies of the Bakufu. The National Army and Navy, which had already been formed under Tokugawa command, were strengthened by the assistance of the Russians and the Tracy mission provided by the British Royal Navy. Equipment was also purchased from the United States. The outlook among many was that the Tokugawa shogunate was gaining ground towards renewed strength and power. However, it fell in less than a year. After resigning in late 1867, he went into retirement and largely avoided the public eye for the rest of his life. Western military training. Through its representative to Europe, Shibata Takenaka, the Tokugawa shogunate made a request to Emperor Napoleon III with the intention of modernizing the Japanese military forces. The French military mission of 1867-1868 was one of the first foreign military training missions to Japan. Shibata had further asked both the United Kingdom and France to deploy a military mission for training in Western warfare. Shibata was already negotiating with the French for building of the Yokosuka shipyard. Through the Tracy mission, the United Kingdom supported the Bakufu naval forces. Before the Tokugawa shogunate was defeated by the imperial troops in the Boshin War in 1868, the military mission was able to train an elite corps of Shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the Denshitai, for a little over a year. Following that, the newly appointed Meiji Emperor issued an order in October 1868 for the French military mission to depart Japan. End of the Edo period. Emperor Komei died at the age of 35. It's generally believed due to the smallpox epidemic. This marked the end of the Edo period. Emperor Meiji ascended the chrysanthemum throne. This marked the start of the Meiji period. Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration was a political event that restored practical imperial rule to Japan in 1868 under Emperor Meiji. Although there were ruling emperors before the Meiji Restoration, the events restored practical abilities and consolidated the political system under the Emperor of Japan. The goals of the restored government were expressed by the new emperor in the Charter Oath. The restoration led to enormous changes in Japan's political and social structure and spanned both the late Edo period, often called the Bakumatsu, and the beginning of the Meiji era, during which time Japan rapidly industrialized and adopted Western ideas and production methods. Boshin War. The Boshin War, sometimes known as the Japanese Civil War, was a civil war in Japan fought from 1868 to 1869 between forces of the ruling Tokugawa shogunate and a clique seeking to seize political power in the name of imperial court. The war was founded in dissatisfaction among many nobles and young samurai, with the shogunate's handling of foreigners following the opening of Japan during the prior decade. Increasing Western influence in the economy led to a decline similar to that of other Asian countries at the time. An alliance of Western samurai, particularly the domains of Choshu, Satsuma, and Tosa, and court officials secured control of the imperial court and influenced the young Emperor Meiji. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the sitting shogun, realizing the futility of his situation, abdicated political power to the emperor. Yoshinobu had hoped that by doing this, the House of Tokugawa could be preserved and participate in the future government. However, military movements by imperial forces, partisan violence in Edo, and an imperial decree promoted by Satsuma and Choshu abolishing the House of Tokugawa led Yoshinobu to launch a military campaign to seize the emperor's court in Kyoto. The military tide rapidly turned in favor of the smaller but relatively modernized imperial faction, and after a series of battles culminating in the surrender of Edo, Yoshinobu personally surrendered. Those loyal to the Tokugawa retreated to northern Honshu and later to Hokkaido, where they founded the Republic of Ezo. Defeat at the Battle of Hakodate broke this last holdout and left imperial rule supreme throughout the whole of Japan, completing the military phase of the Meiji Restoration. Around 69,000 men were mobilized during the conflict, and of these about 8,200 were killed. In the end, the victorious imperial faction abandoned its objective of expelling foreigners from Japan, and instead adopted a policy of continued modernization with an eye to eventual renegotiation of the unequal treaties with the Western powers. Due to the persistence of Saigo Takamori, a prominent leader of the imperial faction, the Tokugawa loyalists were shown clemency, and many former shogunate leaders and samurai were later given positions of responsibility under the new government. When the Boshin War began, Japan was already modernizing, following the same course of advancement as that of the industrialized Western nations. Since Western nations, especially the United Kingdom and France, were deeply involved in the country's politics, the installation of imperial power added more turbulence to the conflict. Over time, the war has been romanticized as a bloodless revolution, as the number of casualties was small relative to the size of Japan's population. However, conflicts soon emerged between the Western samurai and the modernists in the imperial faction, which led to the bloodier Satsuma Rebellion.
We offer you deep historical information from History on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.